Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
We're back. It's Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Dennis Rimmer here, and with us on the line from the Ottawa area, the Kitchissippi ward, just like Mississippi, only different, in the Ottawa area, Don Butler, the author of A Life of Bliss. So apparently, Don, the Kitchissippi name means great river, so what does Mississippi mean, if you know?
I guess even greater river, the only thing I can think of. But yeah, we live pretty close to the river. I mean, we can walk down to it in 10 minutes from where we are. And, we swim in it. It's great to have.
Really? You can swim in that river?
Absolutely. There's a nice little beach not too far from us. So, yeah, it's lovely. We get down there a lot during the summer and enjoy the water.
Now, you live in Ottawa. This is Don Butler we're talking with. So you've been there for many a year. Your parents and you apparently moved there in your mid-teens. What do you like best about Ottawa?
Oh, geez. I mean, Ottawa is to my mind, has got the best of just about everything when you're thinking of a city. It's not so big or so crowded that it becomes, gridlock traffic, although that's starting to happen more now. But you can get out of town quickly and be in the countryside in a few minutes, be out in nature. It's got all of the amenities of a city, maybe fewer of them than, say, Toronto or Montreal, but pretty much all the same sorts of things. Good restaurants, culture. Many of the attributes that draw people to cities, Ottawa has, but it's a sort of a livable scale place.
Well, in your book, A Life of Bliss, the main character is a guy named Bliss Browning, and he mentions that. He says there's hardly ever any violent crime in the area. In fact, when even there's an assault, his newspaper, The Advocate, sometimes writes it up. So is it Ottawa still sort of on the safer side?
It is, but that book is set probably 15 years ago chronologically, so it isn't quite contemporary. And certainly there's been more, drugs and gang crime, that sort of thing, since the time that I set that novel. But it's not that frequent. Like, we might have 10 or 12 murders a year in this city, maybe a few more on a bad year, but compared to a lot of cities, that's a pretty small number.
That's right, and it's mostly probably domestic disputes or something silly like that. Not silly in that sense, but not usually gigantic organized crime, massive mob wipeouts, I'm sure.
No, there's when that's involved, it's usually a couple of gangs, who battling for turf or something, and they shoot each other, but they don't usually affect anybody else.
That's right. Don Butler is with us. We'll get back on track here. The book we're talking about is A Life of Bliss. So, Don, you were born and raised in Montreal, then moved to Toronto, now in Ottawa. You've been there for a long time. And you worked for 40 years at the Ottawa Citizen newspaper. So how'd you get so lucky to stay in one job for all that many years?
Well, I was very fortunate, actually. I think my life was well timed, if you want to look at it that way, because I went to Carleton University for journalism, and got a summer job at the Citizen while I was still there, and that turned into a permanent job after I graduated. And the Citizen did very well for most of the years that I worked there. It was a successful paper, making lots of money and having lots of readers. And there was really no layoffs. There was really no reason to leave. I liked the city. My family and everyone, of course, all liked the city. And I had a variety of different jobs at the Citizen that sort of kept me engaged and interested. So really, I mean, I was never tempted to go anywhere else.
And that's the good thing about having a career such as that. I'm sure it's the same place for, like you say, 40 years or so, but different kind of tasks and roles tossed in there. So you weren't, repeating the same year over and over again. You had something different all the time.
Oh yeah, I had a lot of different jobs there. I was a reporter in a variety of capacities. I covered politics. I wrote features. I wrote editorials. I was in several managerial positions, including At one point, I had about a 6-year stretch as the paper's executive editor, which is more of a news management side of things. So it was interesting. It was an interesting life, and if I had it to live over and newspapers were still a thing, I think I would just do it again.
Oh, I wish they would still be a thing. I miss daily newspapers. I love going back in the archives and seeing stories from 1913 or whenever. In fact, I remember I would do a lot of research with old newspapers, and there was a 5 o'clock edition of, I'm sure it was the Citizen, but it might have been the other Ottawa newspaper. They had stuff out on the street at 5 in the afternoon about stuff that happened that afternoon. Well, that's quicker than the internet.
No, well, it's at least somewhat like the internet. Yes, I mean, yeah, you're right. In those days we had morning editions and we had afternoon editions, and of course the afternoon edition was for a long time was the home delivered edition. You would get that delivered by kids when they got out of school, and land on your doorstep at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And the morning edition was the one that went on the newsstands in the morning. But then it all turned around at one point, and the morning edition became the delivery edition. And the later edition was the one that would be maybe out on the newsstands for a while until we just went to straight mornings.
Right. Well, I used to be a newspaper carrier as well in my teens, and I always thought it was weird that the multi-million-dollar business like a newspaper would trust the delivery of its product to kids who could barely count and throw it at the doorstep, and if they were lucky, it landed. If not, it didn't. So
yep.
It always seemed
weird. No, you're right, and one of the things, of course, about working there for all those years is it gave me a lot of material that I incorporated in my novel, because it is a bit of a newsroom satire. At least it starts out that way. It evolves in other directions as it goes along, but I have a cast of characters in there, and many of them were inspired by people that I met while working at the Citizen.
That's right. We're talking about A Life of Bliss by Butler. The main character is a reporter, Bliss Browning. Before we get to him, though, how about in your early years, grade school, high school, what kind of books did you like to read? Because I'm sure you did.
I did, actually. I mean, when I was a young child, like in my, say, 8, 10 years old, I remember I used to go down to the library and I would take out 6 books. Now, they were juvenile fiction, of course, but I liked a lot of the sports books, things by Scott Young and people like that as a kid.
Right.
So I gravitated to that sort of book. And as I got older, into my teens, I started, reading obviously more advanced things. And one of the first books that really made a big impression on me was There were a couple of books by John Barth. I don't know if you know John Barth, but he was kind of a literary fiction writer in the 60s and 70s, I suppose. And he wrote a couple of novels that I really enjoyed. Just a brilliant writer. So that kind of thing. I also really got into the novels of John Irving at a certain point. I love the kinds of stories he told and the writing style he had. And so there's a lot of that sort of thing that I really enjoyed and I still enjoy as a reader.
And why'd you get into the newspaper business or a journalism career? What led you to that?
Well, I was one of those kids in school, in public school and high school, who did a good job, I guess, or did well at composition. So if we were asked to write about something, I would usually write something pretty good. Sometimes the teacher would ask me to read it aloud, which was a little bit embarrassing, but also gratifying. And I sort of formed the idea at that point in my teens, I guess, that I could be some sort of a writer in my life. That's one thing I seem to have a skill for. And when I was casting around for what to do after I graduated from high school, or what I should be doing after I graduated from high school, I thought, well, journalism school, I don't really, at the time, I didn't really think of a career in journalism, but I thought that would probably help me become a better writer. I would learn some things there that could advance my career as I imagined it as a novelist, I suppose I thought at the time. And then I got kind of hijacked by journalism because A, it pays,
yeah,
and B, I found I enjoyed it. I found I really liked it.
And we're talking with Don Butler about A Life of Bliss. The main character is a chap called Bliss Browning. So can you describe Bliss Browning to us, please? Besides the fact that, how shall we put this, he's embarrassed by his cocktail sausage, let's say.
Yeah, we won't get into that. But basically, he's a guy who has a very low self-esteem. He's very unsure of himself. He's not very distinguished in his life. He had a failed, exceptionally brief marriage, didn't really survive the honeymoon. And he's the travel editor of the Daily Advocate in Ottawa, but he's never gone anywhere, and in fact, he's afraid to travel. He's just a fearful, phobic kind of character, right? And so that's the raw material that we start with. But the one thing that he's pretty good at is he has developed an expertise in the life and art of Maria Callas, the now long dead but very famous opera diva. And he goes online and talks about her, and people start to respect him as an authority. So that's his one claim to fame, if you like. So that's basically where he's at. But he doesn't get much respect in his world, in his life, in his journalism. He's kind of seen as a spare part by his bosses. They put him in as travel editor because they needed somebody to do the job, and they could spare him anywhere else because he wasn't really thought of as being very valuable.
Poor guy. And then Maria Callas enters his life, like you said. Now, back then, diva had kind of a different connotation than now, because diva, that was sort of the opera star, not necessarily a superstar who acts out outrageously all the time. Is that more or less correct?
That is more or less correct. It's certainly, when you talked about divas in those days, you were probably referring to opera stars. But Maria Callas, of course, was quite famous for her temperamental attitudes and her just her character being very demanding. So she actually had a little bit of both the modern definition of diva and certainly a lot of the old-fashioned definition as well.
So Bliss Browning in A Life of Bliss by Don Butler gets these mysterious messages about Maria Callas. He thinks they're from Maria Callas, and he ends up going to Greece. So are you an opera follower yourself, and have you been to Greece?
Indeed, I have, and that's one of the reasons why I think I gravitated to that storyline when I was thinking about this book. I had been to Greece a couple of times before I thought of writing it, and I really love the country. I love it as a travel destination, and really enjoyed my time there. And when I decided, my wife and I decided to go there around the time I was preparing to write it, and we combined a kind of a holiday, but with a research element, if you like. So we went to some of the sites in Greece that show up in the book, sort of the Maria Callas trail, if you like. Mm-hmm. But we also did many of the same things as my character does in Greece. He takes a train ride, for example, from Athens to a place called Kalamata in the Peloponnese. We did that. He rents a car and drives to a site in Greece. We did that. He has an encounter with a prickly pear where he gets a bunch of prickly pear needles stuck in his finger. Well, you know what? That happened to us too.
Oh, come on.
So in fact, that trip really helped in many ways develop much of the sort of the episodic parts of the novel that occur in Greece, because we were just drawing on our own experience.
Now, Kalamata olives are from that area, is that right?
Absolutely, yeah, and my favorites too.
Me too, I love olives. Okay, so this is Bliss Browning, and he goes off to Greece, lured by somewhat mysterious presence of Maria Callas, the opera. Do you have favorite operas of your own?
I wouldn't say I have favorite operas. I mean, I like opera. I like to listen to it sometimes. I've seen, maybe half a dozen or 8 operas in my life live. So, I mean, it's not that I'm not interested in opera at all. I am, but I'm not an opera buff in any meaningful sense of the word. So I couldn't say, Marriage of Figaro, I've seen that. I thought that was excellent. But I'm not the kind of person who would be able to rhyme off 6 operas that are my favorites.
Right.
I just haven't seen that many of them.
I can't say I've seen any, but that's beside the point. So, A Life of
Right.
Bliss, A Life of Bliss by Don Butler. It's from Ottawa Press and Publishing. How'd you get connected with those guys?
Well, the guy who owns Ottawa Press and Publishing is a fellow named Ron Corbett, and he was a journalist as well in his earlier life, and he spent a few years working at the Citizen as well when I was there, and I was actually kind of his boss. I mean, I was executive editor during some of that time, and he was one of the reporters or columnists there. So I knew him from the Citizen, and when I had the book ready and I was looking for a publisher, I thought, well, I'll approach Ron because he knows me, I could foot in the door.
Yep.
And send him some sample chapters, which he liked. In fact, he said he loved them. And the only problem was that when I first approached him, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And he said, my timing sucked. That's a direct quote. Because he could no longer, at that point, accept any new books because he wasn't getting access to bookstores and they were all closing and that sort of thing. So we sort of had to wait a bit. And then late last year, when things started to settle down a bit, I approached him again and he said, yeah, let's go ahead with it. We'll do it as an ebook. And that means that, people can download it to their Kindle or whatever device they might have. And you can get it as a paperback, but it's a print-on-demand paperback. So in other words, you put your order in at Amazon, they print it up and they send it out to you. And it works pretty well, surprisingly. It's a kind of an amazing process.
Yeah, I would think so because usually the way I even now get books, I like to look at them, hold them, read the back cover, find out who the author is, that kind of stuff. So I didn't know in my own life if ebooks were ever going to go anywhere, but apparently I'm wrong.
Well, I can tell you that as a guy who's now 71, and I've been wearing glasses for 60 years, my eyesight isn't getting any better, right? And frankly, when I read books now, I find it's helpful to have them on my Kindle because I can bump up the type size.
Yes, and you can expand it. Well, I'm 72, so there you go. We're about the same vintage, as it were. So
yes, we are.
Yeah, A Life of Bliss from Don Butler from the Ottawa Press and Publishing people. In fact, we had an earlier book. We've also talked to a guy named John Ivison a couple of times.
Yes, I know John. He's also, of course, a journalist and writes a column for the National Post. And my wife, actually, who's also a journalist. We seem to move in a lot of journalistic circles here. At one point was sort of the head of the bureau that he worked in. So yeah, we have connections to John, and I read his book, the one about Robbie Burns.
Robbie Burns, yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I read. It's an excellent book. I really enjoyed it, and I thought he'd done a superb job of capturing the vernacular of the time. And he used real episodes from Robbie Burns's life, and that gave it a lot of veracity. And in some ways, I did something similar, although probably not as well as he did, because I tried to use real episodes from Maria Callas's life. For example, one of the main elements here is when Bliss Browning is sent off to Greece, he's supposed to track down Callas's long lost son. And well, in fact, Callas, there was rumors in the 60s that she did have a child who died. It probably didn't happen. It was more likely that she had a miscarriage or something. But the fact is, there was a lot of speculation about her having a child. So, when I read that kind of planted the idea in my mind to use some real life episodes from her own background and build the plot around those.
It's excellent. It's A Life of Bliss by Don Butler. So about the writing process now, how many did you do? Lots of rewrites, or being from the newspaper world, I think you would just be able to pound this stuff out real quick and get it the way you wanted it to be.
Well, it's not totally true, but I would have to say that when I sat down to write it, I was fairly disciplined. I would write, I was actually working part-time at the time, so I was working 3 days a week, and I took 2 days a week, and I devoted those to writing. And it's a sort of an an intimidating thing when you're starting to write something that's going to be thousands and thousands of words long, and you're trying to figure out, how to get it going, and what all the episodes are going to be and what the plot line's going to be. But I just worked through it steadily, and I would have to say that my first draft, although it did undergo revisions, isn't that dissimilar to my finished product.
Now, did you have an editor along the way?
Well, my editor was really my wife. As I say, she's a journalist, and she actually is one of the best editors that I know. She really is superb. That's her. She does do some writing, but mostly she's an editor as well. So she gave it a good hard look. She had many suggestions about things I could improve, plot that I should amend because she didn't think it worked. So yeah, she was my editor, and when the book was published, there was another person who did essentially a proofread of it, but they didn't really provide. At that point, it was a finished product. It just needed to be checked.
A Life of Bliss from Don Butler is his latest or first published fiction. Any more in the pipeline?
Well, when I wrote that book, I didn't necessarily think there would be, but honestly, I'll get a fair bit of feedback from people who've read it, and it's at least the people I hear from seem to have really liked it. And many of them actually have said, "Can't wait to read your next one." So I think, okay, maybe I should write another one. So I'm actually thinking very seriously about doing so next year, maybe starting early in the new year, using some of the same characters that are in this book. Because I imagine that there's a lot of colorful characters in this story, a lot of them from the newsroom. And I think I can tell some other stories of some of these other characters, some of their backstory and what happens to them going forward, and kind of keep that tale coherently going forward.
Now, you mentioned in your article that was in the Kitchissippi Times about reading a lot of books written by people like me. People are trying to make an impression, trying to make a mark as authors. You found those apparently to be very satisfying. So were those a lot of self-published works, for instance?
In some cases, certainly I know a journalist who used to work at the Citizen, then went off and worked at the Toronto Star for many years, but named Mark Richardson, just published his first mystery novel, and it was self-published. So he's one guy that I'm thinking of when I say that sort of thing. But there also are others who are published not by major publishing houses, but small regional publishers like mine. Like John Iveson's book was actually published by Ottawa Press and Publishing too. Right. And I found that there's a community, an online community on Twitter particularly, of writers who I've never heard of, and probably 98% of the people in the world have never heard of, but they're prolific. In some cases, they've written many books, and they support each other. They encourage each other. They promote each other. And, I think it was a good discovery that there are such people out there, and that I guess I'm one of them now, yes. But that you can rely on and are eager to help you out.
How did you run across our podcast and our site?
Well, your site I found, because I live on Twitter a fair bit these days because of trying to figure out ways to promote my book, and I saw you had tweeted quite a few of your past podcasts at a certain point. I think it was in the summer, and one of them was John Ivison, in fact. So I realized that you had done something with John. I listened to it. I thought it was quite good. I spoke to John. He encouraged me to do it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to see if Dennis will have a chat with me.
And then my executive producer took over from there. So the rest is history. Any tips out there you'd like to give to would-be or people starting out or thinking of writing but never have yet got around to it?
Well, I think there's a lot of people who do want to write. Just a small sideline before I get back to your question. I was in the public library in Ottawa because I was donating a copy of my book so that they'd have a couple in their collection. And I spoke to somebody, a librarian in there, not even a librarian. I think she was just someone who was helping check out books, but wasn't a full-fledged librarian. and we were chatting, and she said, well, I've written something myself. And I said, oh, what did you write? And she said, it's a memoir. And this is just, a random person that I struck up a conversation with in a library. So I believe there's a lot of folks out there who would like to write books, memoirs, mysteries, romances, whatever they might be. And I think the only tip I really have is, recognize that it's going to take some time, but just start doing it. Just begin, and then keep going at whatever pace you're able to do it. I think it's good if you could, be the kind of guy who gets up at 6 a.m. and writes 300 or 3,000 words before breakfast. That's good, but most of us aren't like that.
Not me.
So just give yourself a schedule. Give yourself a couple of hours a day or whatever time you can spare, and make sure you make use of it. And I think if you just put one foot ahead of the other, eventually you'll get there.
How do you write a book? One word at a time.
Exactly.
If you want to be a writer, you have to write. You can't be like me and sit around and think about it. So where can we get A Life of Bliss? In bookstores, online, everywhere, or?
Well, I'd like to say that because it doesn't have a print run per se, it's print on demand, as I was saying before. It's only in a few local bookstores in the Ottawa area, independent bookstores, that I've given them copies on to try and sell for me. So the main place for people probably listening to this podcast is really Amazon.ca, where you could buy it, as I say, either in the Kindle format or as a paperback.
That's Amazon.ca for A Life of Bliss by Dawn Butler. Anything else you'd like to add, pass along before we go?
I don't know if anything really terribly important other than that I hope Saskatchewan isn't wintry yet. We're having a great day here. It's 15 degrees.
I checked that just before I called you up. Yeah, it's sunny and above zero here as well, so I don't know what's going to happen. Apparently winter's supposed to happen eventually, but we'll see about that. But that's another story. So Dawn Butler, again, thank you very much for telling us about yourself and about A Life of Bliss, and especially about the quirky Bliss Browning. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and thank you for your interest, Dennis.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.